he has spoken on the topics faith, family and freedom in Cuba, Belgium, Brazil, Congo, UK and all over the USA to crowds from 14 to 40,000. International leadership speaker, trainer and coach. Author of Learn to Raw Leadership, Attitude Hack, Live a More Excellent Life, 5 Battle Strategies of a Victorious Warrior. 2021 President's Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. Founding partner of the John Maxwell team. Toastmaster International Speech Competition semi-finalist. Founder of Tell It Like It Is TV, ThatGuyRocks.com and ThatGuySpeaks.com. Creator of Story Power TV, Transforming Grace TV, and Leading Leaders Podcast. Producer of 4 TV programs and podcasts for Liftable TV and World Trumpet Television as well as multiple social media channels. Please help me welcome J Loren Norris.
From cookies and sodas to ice cream to Chicky Mickey nuggets, I mean the list goes on and on, all the things that I know my body should not consume. But I still do. I know I shouldn't. I know better. I know that it's a bad idea. I know that it's bad for my health. I know that it's shortening my life. I know that it's impairing my intellectual and cognitive capabilities because a bad diet, as they say, the gut is the brain of the body, and it just doesn't work well when you put all kinds of junk in it. I know that. I know that. But what I do and what I know are not always the same. And in that way, knowing can be a liability. That's what I want to talk about today on Leading Leaders.
Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.
I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. And I admit it, there are a lot of things that I know that I do nothing about. There are a lot of responsibilities in life that come with everything from diet to when you should mow the yard and when you should fertilize the grass before you mow or after you mow, before you water or after you water, before a big rain or after a big rain. When do you put the fertilizer down? When do you put the grass seed down? When are you supposed to prune the trees? When are you supposed to plant the flowers? There are a lot of things that you can easily find the research on and know what you're supposed to do. Maybe for you, it's not the lawn or your diet. Maybe it's, I don't know, how you manage your books or make your sales calls or process the data that comes into your organization or lead the people, or do you know how to communicate to people who communicate differently? Whether it's a language barrier or it's the physicality of person-to-person versus Zoom versus over the phone. I have one particular client who, when she first became a client in 2009, was perfectly auditory. Since then, has had an issue and completely lost her hearing. And the irony is that as she lost the physical ability to hear, she's also lost the ability to speak. She had no problem speaking when we met. 10 years later, she has a completely different speech pattern, thought process. She now thinks in sign first, like many people who have another primary language. And so even our ability to communicate via text message is sometimes limited. The ideas that I would have normally thought, oh, she's going to get that. Let me just kind of summarize it. I have to go back and explain a little bit deeper in order for my client to keep up with what I'm thinking as the next move. That's pretty significant. But just because I know that doesn't mean I'm diligent about the practice of participating at her level. See, it's hard sometimes to remember that not everybody knows what you know. And trust me, sometimes your knowledge is a liability. It's a liability when you assume that everybody can keep up with you. I've been attending and training myself in better communication skills, and I do that from plethora of people at different levels and different styles of communication. I heard a guy say yesterday, he said, some of the stuff that you want to teach is so deep that you make people's brains melt and run out of their ears. Save that stuff for your friends who have master's and doctorate degrees. Have that conversation with them over a cup of coffee or around a round table. That's fine. But when you've got to speak to a large crowd, remember that woman who's back there on the second row from the back. She's a single mother of 3 and trying to figure out just how to make life work. And everything you know doesn't apply to her. You're not going to impress her with what you know. You're going to confuse her. Well, guilty. I've done that. I remember having conversations with people after making a presentation, and they're like, can you just explain this one thing to me? Because when I went over it in my talk, it was a single sentence. It inferred a whole lot of information. I could show you a book. Actually, I can't get to it. It's behind the wall right now. But on my bookshelf is a book by a friend of mine, a personal friend. We first met in Dunkin' Donuts. We've had hours upon hours of conversation since then. The man holds more than one PhD. And in his books, when I read his books, he has one called Politics of Hate, Crimes of Religion, or Crimes of Hate, Politics of Religion, something like that. It's an intense book. And when I read it, there were aha moments that I went, wow, how could that possibly be true? And what else does that mean in the world history, if that's true? But I do know that he is a man who's very well researched, very diligent. Every citation for every claim he's ever made in every book, it's there. In some places, it seems like the bibliography is bigger than the book itself. It's pretty impressive. But I also know that in his writing, because he has more than one PhD, there are times that he'll use a word that I have to stop, look it up, and spend 15 minutes translating that word and all of its accompanying meanings back into my own ability to understand, and then reinsert that thought back into the book. Because the one word would add 4 pages of data to the book if you can't comprehend that word. Now, when people do that just for the purpose of looking or sounding important, that is the definition of pedantic. When people do that because they realize that their audience reads, thinks, processes information at that level, well, that's just speaking to the audience that's in front of you. What we're finding in society is that there's a whole lot of transition and minimalizing of education over the last few decades. And it seems like as we go further, there are more and more people who have higher and higher levels of degrees and less information, knowledge, wisdom, and education behind them. I know that sounds almost unfair and asinine to say, but I could introduce you, I won't because it wouldn't be fair to him, but I can introduce you to a young man who I know for a fact has a degree in computer science. He went from that degree in computer sciences to teaching elementary school. Why? Well, when I asked him about his degree program and what it consisted of, he told me that he had a bachelor's degree from a particular university, but his final exam in the first semester was to create a Word document. Create a Word document. Then he had to, do some formatting things in that Word document, like you got to be able to create the tabs and format the page and put the headers and footers on and type some paragraphs with indentions and bolds and italics and things of that nature. What I would expect the average 4th grader can do with his iPad between classes in order to get ready for his English class. But where this guy went to college, his first semester final exam in computer science was to create a Word document. Oh, he's got a degree in computer science. It's basically useless. He doesn't know anything about computers. If you were to ask him about a transistor versus a resistor, he couldn't tell you. So on the electronics side, he's got nothing. Well, how about coding and programming and, internet access versus bulletin boards? I mean, what's the difference? What's the history? Yeah, I've never studied any of that stuff. So maybe the label is a little salacious, computer science. Maybe that's it. But see, here's another thing that we know. Knowledge can become a liability when you know more than the people who lead you expect you to know. Or when you know more than what the people who lead you want you to know. Sometimes they just know too much for their own good. It becomes a reality. I've been asked to leave places as a leader, a lay leader, a volunteer leader, because I understood things that the person in charge didn't, because I learned things that they didn't know, and they didn't like that. They don't like leading someone who better understands. Usually that's an ego problem on the higher leader, but usually it comes back as an accusation of pride on the part of the junior leader, because when people are outwitted or outsmarted or shown up because they don't know what they say they know or they don't know what they claim they know, they tend to have a problem with that. My sons experienced that as well. They worked in a mechanic shop for a while, and the lead mechanic was happy to give them work that he was getting paid for and supposedly was training them to do, but they already knew how to do the work. And so they were doing it faster than him, and they were finishing all the projects. And the big boss came back and went, how is it you got X number of hours on all of these things, but it didn't take anywhere near that many hours to get it all done? And so as he would find somebody who was actually competent enough to the work to get the certification and therefore split the pay on those jobs, he would stop giving them any work to help. He would kind of shuffle them off. Don't reach my level. Don't get my kind of education. Don't become as smart as me. Why? Well, because intellectuals are a threat. Not pseudo-intellectuals, not people who hold the degree but don't understand the process. People who take the time to get to know. People who take the time to understand. Now, I can tell you, there's still a giant gap in all of humanity between what we actually know and what we actually do. What we know to be right and what we actually do is not usually the same thing. Common sense and common practice, they don't always go together. Education and common sense, they don't always go together. And sometimes knowing what your boss doesn't want you to know, it can cost you. It could cost you the job, could cost you the opportunity, could cost you the position or the title, could cost you a relationship. Sometimes knowing things that another person doesn't want you to know is a threat to them. Sometimes knowing something the other person doesn't want you to know reveals to you that they might be a threat themselves, or that this relationship isn't all it's cracked up to be, or this opportunity isn't all it's cracked up to be. I'll close with this final illustration. I actually had a job interview where I walked in, and I've spent many years in my past in publishing. My dad owned one of the biggest printing shops in all of Dallas-Fort Worth for a long time. Did some work with him, really got to understand the principles and the processes. I've worked in publishing and media sales for a decade and a half or more. And in that process, really got to understand very quickly what the relationship between ad space revenue and publishing space was, what it really boiled down to, and how that process worked. And so I walked into a job interview, and the guy said to me, yeah, you know, if you're just meeting your budget, this is an $80,000 a year job. And I said, really? That's pretty impressive. Tell me a little bit about your page count. How many pages do you publish every month? And he said, about 100. And I said, wow, okay. So is this a publication that's mailed as an editorial, or is this a pick it up for free kind of thing? He said, well, we've had some subscriptions. And so basically we're a mailed publication, but we also have a pretty strong pick it up in the marketplace kind of thing as well. And I said, that's pretty impressive. But so you still have the 60-40 ad edit ratio requirement by the post office? He said, well, yeah. I said, okay, so if you're doing 100 pages, then 60-40 ad edit ratio means that 60% of your content has to be editorial, or at least genuine content, not just ads. And so it means you're only selling 40%, which means you're selling 40 pages. So if my commission structure at 20% means that I'm making $80,000, that means that somehow every month you're selling enough ad revenue that 40 pages represents $1.6 million. I didn't get the job because he had never done the math to come up with the basic idea of what a realistic job looked like. He knew what an earning capacity job should be. He knew that they had published some ads and sold some ads and printed some magazines, but he'd never done the math in his head on a spreadsheet to look at it and say, this is what you could earn if you were just reaching our goals. If I sold every page of advertising they had ever sold, my 20% commission would not have reached $80,000. Their magazine wasn't that strong. Their audience wasn't that strong. Their mailing base wasn't that strong. The content wasn't that strong. The design wasn't that strong. The odds of actually selling it at that level were pretty minimal. But to sell it at that level with an ad rate that he would have had to get, it would have been a $40,000 ad for a single page ad in a magazine. And I don't care if you're talking about the New Yorker or D magazine in Dallas or CEO magazine, they don't get $40,000 for an internal ad. They just don't. When you know, that knowing can sometimes be a liability. It can sometimes be a threat to people who think you're not supposed to know. Now, you can look at that any way you want to. It's true in religious circles. It's true in political circles. It's true in economic circles. I love listening to some of the people like Robert Kiyosaki and Laurel Langmeyer and others who will say that the system isn't broken, it was designed that way. But if you can figure out the rules to the game, you can win at the game just like the people who designed the system. You just have to figure out the rules. The rules, however, are intentionally complicated. They're intentionally lopsided. You've got to figure out those rules and learn to play by them. And some people have. And some people have come from absolute nothing and absolute nowhere because they learn to play by the rules. Because they know. And they do. My challenge to you as a leader is to understand that it is a liability to know what people don't expect you to know or what they don't want you to know. And the only liability bigger than knowing what they don't want you to know is knowing and not doing. I'm J Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.